Hello, and welcome to another episode of the All Things Considered CX podcast. I'm Bob Azman, your host. Glad to have you back listening. I think, as I always say, we have a really interesting guest today to talk about digital customer experience strategy, and his name is Joe Wheeler. Joe is joining us. Welcome, Joe. I appreciate you joining the podcast. Please take a moment, if you would, to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Hey, thanks, Bob. A pleasure to be here. Joe Wheeler. I'm the CEO of CX Digital, a subsidiary of a company I founded with some Harvard Business School professors, Bob, that you're familiar with, called the Service Profit Chain Institute.
Absolutely. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that too in the podcast. I have a long list of things to talk to Joe today, so we'll keep it rolling. Joe, I always ask my guests the same question, and that is, rarely does anybody wake up when they're young or, and say, hey, I want to be a digital expert, or I want to be in customer experience. They might say, I want to be a fireman or a doctor or something like that, but rarely does that happen. And so our listeners love to hear the career path that led you into this field and the success you've realized.
Oh, well, thanks, Bob. Well, it's interesting. I always think that people that grew up in family businesses have this notion of service under their fingernails. And so I was no exception. I grew up in a family business. From about the age of 12, I actually thought my name was coffee or tea because it was a big catering business. And so it's always sort of in your DNA. At the same time, what really drove me to focus, especially around technology, was years ago, I had a role at Hewlett-Packard, and we were implementing manufacturing systems, Bob. And it was just obvious, sort of the challenges these companies faced with the culture change required to embrace technology. And that's when I really realized that what I really wanted to do is become a student about how customer experiences can be designed, but especially ones that leverage technology. And that's when I ended up at the Forum Corporation, where I worked for 17 years. John Humphrey, their founder, just passed away this past March. He was a great mentor of mine. And then, Bob, as you know, in 2002, Sean Smith and I wrote Managing the Customer Experience. Honestly, I don't know if Sean and I really appreciated how successful that book would be. I mean, Pearson sold tons of copies. They're not even clear about how many actually are in production. But that really was a seminal moment, because we just got so much interest because we talked about things that we take for granted today, like journey mapping and things like that for the first time. And so that led to me working with Jim Heskett and Earl Sasser and Len Schlesinger at the Harvard Business School to start the Service Profit Chain Institute in 2005. And that's when I wrote The Ownership Quotient with Jim and Earl. And then this past 12 months, noticed, hard to miss, right, Bob? The impact of COVID-19, and companies that either did or didn't have their digital act together decided to write the digital first customer experience.
Oh, yeah, timing couldn't be better on that, Joe, for sure. We'll get into that. So a couple of thoughts on, thank you for sharing your background. One is, it's interesting you talk about family businesses. And that's why I ask guests to share that career path, because totally unscientific, but I hear this quite often, that the service got in my DNA early because I had a family business, or parents were in some type of service-oriented business. And really, that's what we're looking for in organizations, right? Is getting that into our DNA and not having it be a program of the month, but it's part of our DNA. So I find that very interesting in your background.
Yeah, and Bob, honestly, my good friend Jean Bliss kindly wrote the foreword for this book, which I was so appreciative of. And she grew up, her father had a shoe business, as you know, right? And so I do think there's something to this, but maybe you and I could launch a study.
There you go. I think it would be
real data.
Yeah, get some real data, right? Not qualitative. And then I also want to talk to you for a minute about the Service Profit Institute, because what I find fascinating about the Service Profit Chain is I revisited. I'm an adjunct instructor, and I revisited it recently for one of my courses. And what just fascinates me about some of these early works in the area of service profit, in the area of customer experience, have withstood the test of time, very much like your early book. And I think that's fascinating, that must go to the true nature of what you discovered and uncovered in researching this. I'm just curious, Joe, if you feel the same way in terms of it withstanding the test of time.
Oh, absolutely, Bob. And honestly, full credit to Len Schlesinger and Jim Heskett and Earl Sasser and Tom Jones, I should also add, and Gary Loveman, who were co-authors on the original article. I mean, it makes sense, right? This notion of linking employees, customers, and profits to drive longer term outcomes is intuitive. But the power of the service profit chain over the years has been that detail it provides. I mean, isn't it interesting that one of the case studies in my book is Starbucks, and Bob, as you know, they had a bit of a bump, right? They kind of miscalculated, publicly acknowledged the change in demand and versus capacity, and their frontline staff, really has struggled keeping up with mobile orders and the mix in product from hot to cold beverages. But the truth is, when you read that chapter, I kind of talk you through what their reinvention plan is, right? That Howard Schultz came back to launch. And one of those things they call the Thrive Initiative. And if you look at that model, it looks a lot like the service profit chain. So, I mean, this notion of understanding, Bob, very quickly, years ago, I wrote an article on LinkedIn that got more views than any other views of any of my articles. And the title of it was kind of the myth around how we design customer experiences. And the answer is, it's not just about the customer, right? It's about the employees, the customers, and the shareholders. And great experiences meet the needs of all those stakeholders.
So true. I I did a similar revisit of a book that Don Peppers and Martha Rogers wrote on one-to-one marketing. And again, over 20 years, and it still is very applicable to what we're talking about in customer experience these days. So Joe, I want to talk about the book because it's very timely. You seem to know exactly how to time books that are appropriate for what's happening in the market, which is what I love. But might be a simple question, but help us define digital. And the reason I ask that question is I'm beginning to find that digital is getting a whole bunch of different definitions. You could ask 6 people in an organization across different organizations, what is the meaning of digital? And you might get 6 different answers. From your perspective and your research, help us understand what you mean by digital.
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Bob. And you're familiar. I'm writing this 9 article series on LinkedIn with digital first provocative questions. And the last one, spoiler alert, is the question is, when we say digital first, do we mean people second? And of course, the answer is no. Especially coming out of the mouth of the person who's the director of the Service Profit Chain Institute, right? At the same time, it's funny, Bob. So we would do consulting on the West Coast and the East Coast. And I remember sitting in the former CEO of PayPal's office, a wonderful guy, Rajat Dutta, and I was waiting to meet him for the first time. And in his office was this letter of congratulations. I forget who it was from, that said, "Hey, congratulations on your 140th millionth customer." And I sat there thinking, who has 140 million customers? Maybe a bank in China, with like just, and I thought, and you notice the difference. Companies out West, especially in the Valley, just thought about their businesses differently. And a colleague of mine said, yeah, Joe, it's because they thought digital first. And so when we say digital first, Bob, we don't mean people second. We mean the idea that says, especially today, as AI and machine learning has reached a whole new level of maturity, the truth is where customers will intersect with you will probably be digital. That'll be the first place, the way they connect. So the way we define digital first is like this. We see it as, the delivery of a digital first experience that exceeds expectations on those attributes which most influence customer loyalty while leveraging value over cost. And I realize that sounds a bit like consulting speak, but each one of those elements is important because, number one, as I said, not only is digital first tending to be the first way a customer will intersect with your brand, it's also just being influenced by competition, by culture, by the convergence of technologies, as we're all seeing. Exceeding expectations still hasn't changed. I know for sure from all of our work, Bob, that There are 4 to 5 loyalty drivers in any customer segment that if you can identify them and then understand the touch points that influence the most and consistently exceed those, you will be rewarded with more loyalty. And then finally, at the end of the day, Richard Whiteley, the late Richard Whiteley, taught me this: the most insult you can have on a customer is to go out of business. So we always have to remember the goal here, right, is that make every dollar of operating expense return incremental financial benefits to all those 3 stakeholders and try to produce a whole greater than the sum of its parts. So Bob, what do you think of my definition? Does it work?
That works for me. I think it really encompasses all the various components. And I think that's one of the challenges we're having, Joe, with digital is what are all the components of it? And I think your definition does a nice job of encompassing those. So tell me this, Joe, why is it that we have companies that are still taking their website and throwing it on an app and calling it a mobile app? Why do we have organizations that are just not getting up to speed on digital, even though we've been on the internet 30, 40 years, something like that? What's your perspective on what's the barrier? What are the challenges? What's happening there where companies aren't coming up to speed quickly on digital?
Well,
and of course, I'm setting aside AI and so forth. I'm just saying kind of your basic digital engagement with the customer because the customer demands it, as you so aptly said.
yeah. Well, three quick comments about that, Bob. One is, there's an old saying in the product development business to don't fall in love with your solution, fall in love with the problem. and I think in a world where, like in the first introduction, I talk about digital promise apparel, and I feature Zoom Pizza, which I think was a terrific idea. And they raised like almost $400 million in investment to scale that, but I think it lasted about 22 months. And you realize, Domino's did a pretty good job. Like in 30 minutes, I could get a pizza, and I kind of love their experience. I'd like to know that the delivery person was going to show up when he did with that pizza trucker. So long story short, one problem I see is, companies fall in love with a technology. And boy, that's even more prevalent now with the excitement around generative AI. So that's one. The second one is they focus. It's not that they focus on that they're not focusing on problems. They're just not, they're looking at the squeaky wheel and not really the bigger things that customers want solved. So they react to things and actually create lots of improvements. Well, I'll give you an example. I was working with a company in Toronto, Bob, and we were designing their customer experience and building their balanced scorecard. And the head of operations, fellow George, reported to the CEO in the meeting. He said, listen, I'm delighted to share that we reduced the average speed of answer from 10 seconds to 5 seconds. So the CEO says, really? So he picks up the phone, he calls their 1-800. Sure enough, 5 seconds later, someone answers the phone, very polite. John thanks them and hangs up. And he goes, George, what did that cost? George says, $950,000. There's this silence in the room, and the CEO says, you know what, George? I'd have waited another 5 seconds.
Oh, no. Oh, my gosh.
Here's the thing. This sort of stuff happens all the time. Now, maybe George had like a deep tree diagram that they needed to deliver in 5 seconds. I don't think so. At the end of the day, the second problem people have is they don't solve the problems that really matter to customers, employees, and customers because they don't do enough robust research. And then the third thing that I think gets these things off track is, and I don't mean to be, but sometimes when we work with clients and I say, so how have you embraced rapid experimentation and agile methodologies? And they'll say, oh yeah, we hired a guy. We hired a guy from Toyota, or we hired a person from Amazon who's leading the agile process. And then you go and try to find those people and you can't find them. They're like off into some cubicle in a satellite office. So you have to actually do agile, Bob. You can't just buy the book. You actually have to use rapid experimentation methods, not just read about it from someone like me. And that is the third thing, is the stage gate kind of top down. We really haven't lost that. And I think when organizations don't embrace this notion of test and learn and rapid experimentation, it's problematic. Long-winded answer. Apologize for that.
No, not at all. Let's talk about a little bit about this answer too. One of the chords that you struck with me is falling in love with technology. I worked at a company that sold customer experience technology. And what would often happen is customers would come to us and they'd say, I need to buy new technology. We'd say, why? And they'd say, well, I have to improve my customer experience. And we'd say, well, what is the customer experience you're trying to improve? And there would be silence in the room. And it was an unknown problem, but the solution was technology. And to your point, let's find out what the core problem really is before we go about fixing it. So I think you really hit something there that I see a lot with organizations. And the second, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was just going to quickly say, to be fair,
Yeah.
there's so much pressure in companies around performance, especially publicly traded companies. You can understand why people, they don't want to sit on their hands. They want to take action. We had a client who we did a qualitative study to look at, did a detractor analysis, and the results proved that price was really important. Well, the CEO was gung-ho to almost start a price war to go after it. And I convinced him, just, let's pause until we get the quantitative research. And in truth, 1,700 responses proved that when they got the first 3 attributes wrong, price did become important, but it was 5th on the list. So, it's one of these things where I understand how people want to take action. At the same time, patience tends to reward longer term success, I think. Anyway, Bob, sorry to interrupt you.
So Joe, do you see that organizations are kind of on either end of a spectrum? So you've got those that want to, get information and want to take immediate action, even though it might be somewhat misguided. And on the other end of the spectrum is collecting a lot of data and not doing anything with it. I mean, is there that difference in organizations that you see?
Well, I think, great question. So you're heading towards an important topic. I did a LinkedIn post you read, Bob, which was, do we really have to ask customers if they're happy? Because in a digital first world, we have a lot more breadcrumbs. Even in a cookie-less world in the future, we'll have more data around customers' behaviors. So I do think there's a data gap, and I think that's closing fast with technologies you're familiar with. I do. At the second time, I think the thing that is most interesting to me is, 6 or 7 years ago, you could launch even a global initiative around CX and kind of manage stakeholder expectations. Today, with the level of technology, this is more challenging. Like one of the examples in the book, Bob, is Cemex, and they have won awards for their digital transformation efforts called Cemex Go. The more important attribution they get, though, is from their customers who have just adopted Cemex Go like remarkably. And they did 3 things. They did a lot of things, but 3 things that really stand out. One was they took their whole executive team for a week and took them to MIT and trained them just on digital technology, blockchain, immersive experiences, just really got them understanding AI, machine learning, where this was headed, right? That's the big investment, but it had a big impact when they were rolling Cemex out globally, because these executives didn't have a 40-minute overview of the project. They had 5 days at MIT to understand this was changing their business model. It wasn't a digitization initiative. It was going to change how Cemex served their customers and deliver products and services. That was a big thing. The second thing they did was the executive, the executive support for this was just, and you hear this all the time from people that do this work, Bob, and you know it yourself. It was way beyond commitment. It's much more involved. So the CEO personally went and visited the Scrum teams, asked what they needed, what was getting in the way. So they really supported it from the top down. And number 3, they did a very unique thing, Bob. They organized the design team, the UX team, the data science team, the IT team, all under the same leader. I don't see that too often in organizations. They basically, instead of trying to cut through the silos, they just put together under one leader, and the impact it had in speed. Now, it still took them 2 years to get done, but I tell you, if they hadn't done that, I'm curious as to how long it might have taken. And that, to me, was a best practice.
And by the way, listeners, Joe was kind enough to send that excerpt to me from the book to read through it. And I would add, Joe, that one of the things that was impactful to me in reading that was and you just noted this with the organizational structure, this was end to end. This wasn't just an operations functional initiative or a marketing initiative. This was end to end. And that was really what impressed me about this success story.
Well, and talk about talk about luck. Well, I don't know if it was luck or not, but they brought Cemex Go to market just before, like this was happening in the U.S. and starting to scale globally as COVID hit. So, talk about a business that required touchless experience. And so they're the first ones to say, hey, we were kind of lucky to get this in place before COVID really started, because it did help their business dramatically. But it's another great example of the design of Cemex Go didn't just serve customers; it also served their drivers. And if anyone listening to this podcast grew up in the construction industry, my father had a construction business part-time because he didn't have enough to do running a banquet hall. Knows driving a cement truck or a ready mix truck is a really tough job. And the driver experience for Cemex just improved dramatically with Cemex Go. They now knew exactly where to go. There was no mystery about when the delivery would be. If there was a change in it, they were notified safely in real time. There's lots of regulatory requirements around driving a cement truck, as you would imagine. Cemex Go just helped with those, because you can't, almost like pilots, Bob, you can't have drivers more than X number of shifts in certain geographies. So this was a way for them to understand how to manage to that. Check the boxes of things that they did well around this. Now, they'll be the first to say that it wasn't perfect. In fact, the head of digital said to me at one point, you'll like this, Bob, they hired a technology firm, obviously, to help them with a lot of these things. And they taught them this idea of a minimal viable product. And he said, we did this for a few months doing these prototypes with our customers. And I realized it just wasn't our brand. So we renamed them minimal lovable experiences, because, we weren't trying to do the minimum. We wanted to exceed expectations on those key touch points. And he said, it made all the difference.
And of course, tying the brand in, right? That's so important as well.
Yes. Well, I mean, readers that do decide to buy the book, I mean, I hope they enjoy the chapter, especially on Nike. And the reason why I chose Nike as the example of designing immersive experiences isn't just how impressive they are in terms of personalizing both physical, digital, and human experiences, especially when you visit like the House of Innovation in New York or one of the other locations. It's how it's connected to their brand voice. I mean, their mission and brand values just stand out in every aspect of how they deliver the experience, including their commitment to net zero. And that every one of these companies, Bob, I might say, just as an ad, is what's interesting is, their ESG initiatives, their net zero isn't like a program that the finance team is looking into. Like, it's core to their business model, like the way they manufacture products, how they reclaim products, how they recycle materials. It's embedded into their digital first experience, and it's just important today, right?
Absolutely. No question about that. So, Joe, we've been talking about the book. Tell us a little bit more about it, so our listeners are enticed to go buy it, because I know just listening to you makes me want to buy multiple copies of the book. So, so tell us about the book.
Well, Bob, from
Please.
your lips to God's ears, as they say. Well, there's three parts to it. One is I begin by talking about what I call the 3 C's, which is the impact that's kind of driving these changes in terms of culture, competition, et cetera, and the convergence of 5 technologies from the emergence of edge-based computing with machine learning and AI, et cetera. One fact I learned from my colleagues in the telecom industry that and often people don't realize how much faster 6G will be over 5G when it's fully operational. Now, it's a different transition to 6G than from 5G, because there's almost like broadband design infrastructure that'll change with that. So it'll be incremental, is what I'm told. It won't be like you turn on your phone and suddenly you're on a 6G network. 5G will improve, and then eventually it'll move to 6G. But 6G fully operational will be like 30 to 50 times faster than 5G. I mean, think about that for a second, Bob. I mean, think about your Wi-Fi right now running 30 times faster. What does that mean in terms of the kind of immersive experiences that you can design, right? So the first piece kind of talks about these kind of important trends and what it means for design. And then the second are the 7 design principles, from achieving emotional peaks across channels, finishing strong, through to linking digital assets to leverage value over cost, with a great example from Amazon retail around that. And then the third section is the playbook. So I thought it would be important to provide readers with kind of a way to take action from what they've learned in the 7 strategies, and start by solving the right problems. Build your business case. This is one of my pet peeves. Often I see when we work with clients, it's not that their business case wasn't solid, is it didn't exist. Like, they just said, well, this is the right thing to do, let's go get it. And that's a fool's errand, because at some point someone's going to say, hey, Bob, can we go through your plan again? What was the incremental margin you were expecting to achieve from this? Because all I'm seeing is costs. And then we talk about the design process. And then I give a walk through an example of how do you execute this to scale across product groups or geographies, and try to include some tools. Sean and I learned that managing the customer experience. People love the tools that were in the appendix. So that final chapter includes like real examples of like ideal storyboards and release plans. And anyway, so I hope that kind of gives enough of an overview, Bob.
It certainly does, Joe. And I agree with you 100% that ability to use those tools, because that forces us as readers and as practitioners and professionals in the area of customer experience to take action. We don't have any excuse. You give us the information, the background, and then you give us a roadmap and how to do it. And I think that's so important. The old adage about you're teaching us how to fish, and I think that's really important.
Well, I'll share one kind of funny story. We were doing this big design session in Miami with a client, and we had the head of Agile. This company had just transitioned from kind of waterfall method to an Agile team, Agile methodology. And this fellow was new, who was leading this group. He'd come into the company. He's only there like a month or two. So of course, we had IT at the table with us right from the beginning of this whole redesign effort. And one of the project leaders working on one part of the experience, and one of the managers turned to this person and said, listen, I realize we've done this work based on the data. We feel like we need to change this part, but it has big IT implications, which obviously you won't be able to change. And he looked her straight in the eye and he said, no. He goes, well, tell me, like, what is it? He said, we're here because, don't think of it as this old, put in your ticket request and we'll get to it in 6 months. We are going to test new code, release it to customers, get their feedback, test and learn, and improve it. So if you've got a change here, we want that change. And Bob, I tell you that story because I think this is a transition that needs to happen in more and more organizations. Like, this is the detail of the work. So this is when you start to see real change happening, when conversations that were kind of assumptions about the old legacy culture that I wouldn't even think of challenging suddenly get disrupted with something like Agile. And that's when you see a real progress getting made in these companies.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Joe, we used to call that a burning platform. That change came from burning platforms. The COVID, the pandemic, some would argue, was a burning platform that forced companies to change. Do you think that's applicable here in what you were just talking about? Does that help companies make changes?
Yeah, 100%. And in fact, my good friend David Rogers' new book is coming out at the end of the month called The Digital Transformation Roadmap. It builds on his previous book, The Playbook. He and I co-delivered some leadership programs around his previous book. And this new book really promises to really deliver tremendous value for companies trying to figure that out. And he makes this point that it must begin with a compelling vision. And with, that it can't be top down. It has to be organic and grow from every part of the company. So building a burning platform, not about digitizing an app, but about what really is possible to redesign experiences that solve a big problem, and B, get the right assembly of digital, human, logistical, messaging, assets that will exceed those expectations on those key loyalty drivers.
That sounds like a great book too, listeners. So stay tuned for that one. Wow, I knew this was going to be a fascinating conversation, Joe, and you did not disappoint me. So for that, I am deeply appreciative. But before we go, where are we headed, Joe? Where is the digital first customer experience headed as you look out a few years from now?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'd say 3 quick comments. One is, So the good news about things like generative AI is it's really going to push organizations to understand how to apply technology in ways we haven't thought of before. At the same time, so there's just no question as we start to control for, as we described, hallucinations, right, when generative AI kind of goes awry. But what companies, I guess people shouldn't look at their personal experience as consumers with like ChatGPT and see that as the corollary to what enterprise grade machine learning based platforms driven by AI will be able to do. Because over the next 12, 24, 36 months, we'll see applications for generative AI that will really have a strong impact. And there will be impact, especially on frontline service roles, as you can imagine, right? Because of the fact that it can create content, okay? But if we're much more narrow on those foundation models, like what makes Lemonade, my first example, really powerful, is their AI bot is trained on a very specific domain. Now, when she's asked 13 questions, she generates 1,700 data points, which is powerful to be able to figure out the right price for you to sell you an insurance policy. So we'll see more examples of that. At the same time, I always say, never think digital first means people second, as I said before, because the thing that people have is that other version of AI called actual intelligence. So we'll see that, but I think a human-centered design has never been more important in digital first companies. It just won't always be delivered by humans, if that makes sense. The second thing is, I have another business working in the ocean tech sector, Bob, called Blue Movement, and we're applying machine learning to digital twinning. We actually won. We didn't win. We were nominated for an Earthshot Prize. So if we win, I get to go to Singapore and be Prince William. We'll see. Fingers crossed on that. But the point is, digital twinning is really going to expand from manufacturing, which is pretty robust right now for companies like BMW, into things like medicine. So, Bob, imagine a doctor might have a digital twin of Bob and be able to test, a medication on your digital twin before he or she prescribes it to you. So that's possible, right? That's where this is going. And then the third thing I think is, and this is out there, but once we start to see this convergence of technologies like edge-based computing and generative AI and machine learning with 6G, with application networks, et cetera, what we will design in the future, especially for retail, will be very different. So you can think of things like optical holographic capabilities delivered, on a surface-based device. You might be able to actually experience your retail experience in your living room before you visit the store. So there's a lot that will happen. I mean, honestly, if you're in the CX business right now, it is just, I just think the most exciting time to be doing the kind of work you and I do, Bob.
Thank you for that, Joe. I think it's fascinating to see what the future is going to hold, and the fact that it is kind of on this accelerated pace, like you just talked about, with 40 or 50 times faster internet connections. It's just accelerating at such a pace. Sometimes it's difficult to keep up with. This has been a great conversation, Joe. Listeners, Joe Wheeler, author of the Digital First Customer Experience. Joe, obviously our listeners can buy the book, but how else can they connect with you and follow the many things that you're doing and writing and so forth? Is it best through LinkedIn?
Yeah, connect through LinkedIn. You visit our website at cxdigital.ai, not .com, or joewheeler.co, and happy to connect with folks. But and Bob, keep a lookout for my next digital first question. They get harder every week.
Oh gosh, yes, I will do that as well. That listeners, that's a great reason to link in with Joe for sure. Joe, thank you very much for your time today. We've really appreciated the conversation.
Thanks, Bob. Real pleasure.
And listeners, this has been another episode of the All Things Considered CX podcast. If you've enjoyed this, please share it with your networks. And as always, stay tuned for more fascinating guests on our podcast as part of the CXFM radio network. Thank you.